Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Colonel Tony Coutts-Britton, guest lecturer with Viking. This isn't my 31st cruise. I'm landbound, just like you, but welcome all. It's Remembrance Day, and so I'm going to take you on a trip around one corner of the Great War. That war, which was the first truly world war, and this is going to take us around a place called Flanders in northern Belgium. I might add at this stage that at the end, whenever we get there, I'll be very pleased to take your questions. Now you can send your questions to Viking, and I will then see them at the end. They'll be put up for me by our director, James, and I'll attempt to answer them best I can. Where to start? Well, look at the title slide. These are poppies. You know, the poppy's a funny old flower. It has to die, its seed has to be buried, and then it has to be uncovered again, normally through harvesting, through ploughing to plant the seeds for the future harvest. And then once it hits light, it regenerates. So what happens with a poppy is dies, buried, rises and flowers. There's an analogy there, but I won't labour it. In any lecture that I do on a Viking ship, and those of you who have sailed with me, well, greetings, shipmates, I always outline the way the lecture is going to pan out. So here we go. Let's look at the outline. I'm going to talk you through a number of staging points in this lecture, and we'll start with the road to war. Wars don't just start. There is a road to get there, and it's important to know that road. 1914-15, the first year and a half of the war, significant developments, and I'll cover those. It's people as well as weapons and as well as tactics and as well as politics. The totality of war is going to grip the world. It's going to grip not just the United Kingdom, not just France, not just Germany, the major European powers, Austria-Hungary engaged in the war. It's going to stretch. It's going to go into Africa. It's going to go into the Far East. It's going to go to the United States, the totality of war, and I will cover that. Flanders, what's special about Flanders? My goodness, who's ever heard of Flanders anyway? There's a Flanders in France and there's a Flanders in Belgium. Used to be, in antiquity, the County of Flanders, a powerful man, the Count of Flanders. Here we're going to talk about Belgian Flanders. I'll try and bust some myths, if I may, and maybe some humbug. Maybe familiar to you, maybe you wouldn't have heard about it before, but I'll take us there and try and get us back to reality. Of course, every story has an end, and we'll get to the end and talk about the legacy. The legacy might surprise you. It's not a tangible legacy. It is quite intangible, but it's very, very meaningful. So let's look at the timeline of the war. The war lasts, this may surprise a few folk, for 6 years. 1914 to 1919. Hang on, everybody's saying. It all ended in 1918, didn't it? No, it didn't. What happened in 1918 was there was an armistice. The guns stopped firing. But we don't get to the end of the war until June of 1919 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. That's going to end the war legally. It's going to be the start point of the road to the next war. But 1919, let's look at these years. 1914, the opening of the war, certainly as far as the British and the Germans are concerned, the Battle of Mons, an encounter battle, neither side expecting to fight there. A retreat by the British to the Marne, a defeat, the first defeat for the Germans, leading to the first Battle of Ypres. And that will take us into Flanders, the beginning of our story. 1915, a regular army, a British regular army being wasted away with attrition. The ambitious plot by the British to kick Turkey out of the war before it even gets into the war. Gallipoli, a failure, unfortunately, but a gallant attempt. And then back to Flanders. 1916, the end of innocence. These are the citizen armies, the first conscripts, all of the volunteers going in, and massive casualties, never to be seen again, never seen before. And just to give you a flavour, on the 1st of July 1916, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 20,000 dead in the British Army. One day. 1718 rolled together. A series of campaigns and battles that are going to see us through from the end of innocence through the beginning of the regeneration of professionalism, a German pulling back, a German resurgence, the beginning of the end for Germany, and the end itself in the armistice. 1919, the forgotten year, when politically Europe is sorting itself out, the world is sorting itself out, and the North Russia expedition in the wake of the October Revolution in Russia. Men are still dying, gallantry awards are still being won, and the fighting is continuing. That is also going to come to an end. Well, throughout that Great War, for the British Empire, 7 million men put on a uniform. It might have been a naval uniform or an army uniform, later an Air Force uniform. And at the end, only 4 million are wearing a uniform. What's happened to 3 million uniformed members of the armed services? Well, this is the simple answer. 860,000 are dead. More than 2 million are so badly wounded they can't return. And I'm only talking here about the United Kingdom. If you want to talk about the British Empire, you raise the left-hand figure to 1 million and you get close to 2.5 million on the right-hand side. An all-embracing citizens' war, the totality of war. Well, wars begin somewhere. And I'm going to just briefly mention to you the shot that shook the world. There on the left-hand side is the Victory Medal. All nations who fought on the winning side in the Great War issued a Victory Medal. The medal itself, the bit of metal at the bottom, is different nation from nation. But curiously, the ribbon is shared by all Allied nations. This is my grandfather's Victory Medal. See the ribbon? A curious thing I shall show you, by the way. Here are his 3 medals. And if you notice something, they've never been mounted. They have never, ever been worn by him. He, like many soldiers, had had enough of war, and he was not prepared to wear his medals. He wasn't a pacifist. He was just fed up with war. On the right-hand side, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. He is heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. He's on a visit to Serbia, and in a town called Sarajevo, he and his wife are assassinated. And though that shot didn't start the war, it shook the world, and it was the catalyst. So, the war began because, well, everybody's got a view. You could say, well, everybody in the hot dog line in New York in the snow's got a view on why things are why things are. In the United Kingdom, we've got an expression. Go and ask the common man, where do you find him? And the answer is on the Clapham omnibus, a guy that gets on a bus to go around town. He's got a view. Well, the common man doesn't get more common than this fellow. And if you've ever watched the Blackadder series, this is Baldrick, who is the orderly to Captain Blackadder, a hardened professional soldier in the trenches. And he says the war began because a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry. hasn't a clue. What is the truth? The war began because it was inevitable. Let me tell you why. The German Empire, and it is an empire, Kaiser is a corruption of the word Caesar, emperor. And German political ambitions, here we see Europe in 1914, are quite clear. Now that map is sort of recognizable, but you see that big red blob in the middle, that's Austria-Hungary. The big green blob to its north is Germany, forged out of Prussia in the late 1860s, 1870s, and a lot of other German states, the new Germany. To my American sisters and brethren, I would say, never let anybody say to you, oh, America is a young nation. It's a darn sight older than Italy, and it's a darn sight older than Germany, and it's a darn sight older than Belgium, which was created in 1830. The story is about battleships. This is His Majesty's ship Dreadnought, a revolutionary design of battleship. The naval architecture had advanced, armaments had advanced, tactical thinking had advanced, and the British put the first ship of this design, HMS Dreadnought, in the water. All ships thereafter were obsolete, all of them, everywhere around the world. The Dreadnought was the way to go, and the Royal Navy had lots of them. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II of Germany, Queen Victoria's grandson, a full first cousin to the King of the United Kingdom, and by the way, a full first cousin to the Tsar of all the Russias, Nicholas II, had an ambition to match British naval power, and he began to build dreadnoughts. He hears dreadnoughts in the Baltic, which was safe from predation, but he had to get them out into the world for them to be effective. And he came up with this idea. He built a canal called the Kiel Canal, and he could keep his battleships safe, but sail them out in one night, out into the Atlantic under way. Clever. Now, the political ambitions are staggering. Germany wanted to seize control of all the English Channel ports on the continental side. Think of Dunkirk, think of Boulogne, think of down to Dieppe. These are to become vassal states. This is Belgium and the Netherlands, vassal states, expanding to the east. Does this sound familiar at all? Because it was to resurrect as a political ambition in the late 1930s. Who's the architect? This man. This is the German Chancellor. In 1909, these political ambitions were put together by this man, Bethmann Hollweg. Bethmann Hollweg. And Germans being Germans, put their military ambition and their military procurement program in lockstep with their political ambitions. So from 1909 onwards, everything was in step, strategically, politically, military. Well, war requires soldiers. Look at this. Let's talk about mobilization. Look at these numbers. They're staggering. Russia can put 6 million men in the field. Germany, 4.5. France, 4 million. Austria-Hungary, 3 million men in the field. But I draw your attention to this. These are not regulars. There are some regulars, but the majority of all of these are reservists and conscripts. Let's look at some pre-war treaties. Treaties are important. Well, there's Europe. Let's look at something called the Triple Entente, the Entente Cordiale, a friendship treaty. Russia, France, the United Kingdom, bound to each other by treaty to come to each other's defense, to respond to aggression. The Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. a defensive treaty. It parades itself, the Central Powers, as a defensive treaty. Well, a couple of other players in the game. Look down at the bottom there. That ellipse covers Serbia and Montenegro. Do, by the way, if you ever get a chance, take Viking's trip around the Adriatic empires of the Mediterranean. Wonderful. You'll call into Montenegro. So what ties those two small states, those two small Slavic states, into the story? Well, they are client states. They're sort of godchildren to Russia. It's all to do with the Orthodox Church. And Russia sees itself as godfather to Serbia and Montenegro. They are problem children to Austria-Hungary. What do I mean by this document, the scrap of paper? Well, Belgium, younger than the United States of America, only created in 1830. It's a state created from the southern Dutch Catholics and the northern French from Artois Catholics. France, an atheist state. The Netherlands, a Lutheran state. After the Napoleonic demise, there's a coming together of the ethnic Belgians. And under the Treaty of London, 1830, and the Treaties of Antwerp, 1832, Belgium is created to guarantee this small, new, weak state's health. The great powers, Prussia, Austria, France, Russia, United Kingdom, come together and sign these treaties guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. The Kaiser of Germany conjured up the name of this treaty when he was preparing to go to war. He said, "Do you think the British will go to war for a scrap of paper?" He was the one that used the phrase scrap of paper, a treaty. Well, to remind you, the Triple Entente, the Central Powers. What's the intention here? Well, certainly Austria is intent, and certainly after the death of the heir to its throne, of taking on the Slavic resistance in the Balkans. That means Russia is going to respond. Germany has now got its political ambition into military lockstep, and it's going to take on France. That commits the United Kingdom to helping France. Bit of a twist in the story. Italy leaves the Central Powers, saying to Germany and to Austria-Hungary, what is happening is not defensive. You are being offensive. You are attacking. We're leaving. Italy later joins the Triple Entente powers and comes into the war and principally fights Austria-Hungary. There's a British expeditionary force. I showed you the 6 million Russians, the 4.5 million Germans, and so on. Look at this. This is Field Marshal Sir John French, who is to command the British expeditionary force. His two subordinate corps commanders are in the middle there, Sir Douglas Haig and Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien. Haig, a cavalryman, Smith-Dorrien, an infantryman, commanding corps. And on the right, Sir Edmund Allenby, commanding an independent cavalry division. Very important in the campaign that is to follow. And they all command this article. This is a British soldier, a regular soldier, nicknamed Tommy, from Tommy Atkins, which is the example name used on all forms. So if you get an example of a form for anything, the example is Thomas Atkins. That's Tommy. And the British Expeditionary Force consists of only 80,000 men. Remember, 6 million Russians, 4.5 million Germans, 80,000. There's a slight difference. All the 80,000 are regular, hard-bitten soldiers. Well, mobilization day, war is declared on midnight on the 4th of August. The morning of the 5th of August sees battalions all over the United Kingdom. parading because the British Expeditionary Force is drawn from the Home Army. It's a British Empire. An awful lot of the army is abroad. A great many of them are in India, in the Indian subcontinent, but many are also in Africa, South America, Central America, the Far East, like Singapore and Hong Kong. So here we have 1,007 officers and men of the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Royal Regiment. That's the wartime establishment of an infantry battalion. It's to be significant. Remember the number, 1,000, put 1,000 here. Mons to the Marne and back. Well, war was declared at midnight on the 4th of August, and by a miracle of logistics, and I'm not sure we could achieve it today, those 80,000 translated themselves from the shores of the United Kingdom to a town in France just south in the centre of the screen of that Belgian town called Mons, to Valenciennes in northern France. 80,000 by steamer, by rail and by road. The German intelligence doesn't know they're there. So the equivalent of Tommy in the German army is known as Fritz. And he sees off the Belgian army around Liège, marches into Brussels, has a victory parade, turns southwest and heads for France, not knowing that those 80,000 troops, British troops, have crossed the French-Belgian border and they are at Mons. The inevitable happens, there's an encounter battle. Neither side knows the other one's there or coming, and the encounter battles are very scrappy and they're very costly. Well, an almighty battle breaks out. Because of the weight of German numbers, the British Expeditionary Force falls back. And they fight by day and they march by night. And they always get away. The Germans cannot pin them down. And it goes on day after day after day. And the British force reaches the River Marne, where the French have closed up to close their right flank. So there's now a line. And British reinforcements have arrived, so now their losses are replaced. There's a battle at the River Marne, and it's very bloody, and it's a British victory. The Germans try to get round this by seeking the British flank, but by night the British move and meet them in the morning. And this goes on night after night, day after day. And eventually they arrive at a town in Belgium called Ypres, and the British meet the right flank of the Belgian army. So with the French on the British right and the Belgians on the British left, there's a solid line. Sometimes people refer to this maneuver as the race for the sea. No one was racing for the sea. Both sides were trying to find the flank of their enemy. So, big battle, first battle of Ypres. Here's a schematic. It's a contemporary sketch map of Ypres that dates from 1914. There is Ypres. All cartography, by the way, in Ypres, although it's a bilingual country, speak Dutch in the north, Flemish, and French in the south, in Wallonia. All cartography is in French. So Y-P-R-E-S, Ypres, although the people that live there say Ypres in Dutch. And the British strike out, heading north, heading east, heading southeast, and they meet the enemy on the high ground. The Germans have stopped on the high ground. And these names are to fall into the British or the English language in the United Kingdom for the next 4 years. Langemarck, Zonnebeker, Gelleveld. The Germans, with their reserves and with their conscripts and with their volunteers, are moving across country as rapidly as they can. Look at that picture, will you? Now, I'm an infantryman. I'm a Royal Fusilier. In my army, from that date and before that date, to this very day, if you move across open country, you'll hear the corporals and the sergeants calling out, spread out, spread out. The German sergeants and corporals would be calling, close up, close up. Why the difference? The British in 1914 were regulars, and they knew that a compacted target would lead to many casualties, so spread out. But in humankind, there's a comfort in being close to another human. These are conscripts. These are wet behind the ears volunteers. A huge number of the people you see in there are high school, sixth form, 18-year-olds who've left their studies early to go and join whilst they still can, because it's all going to be finished by Christmas, you know. Many of them are university students who've been members of the University Officer Training Corps, now at the front. And so there's this comfort of close up, get next to your neighbour. But in the British Army, if you're an infantryman, you get more pay if you are a marksman. You get more pay if you're a first-class shot. You get more pay if you're even a second-class shot. Below second-class shot, you cannot be a British infantryman. And the standard of musketry that you are training to uses this sight on the back of an excellent rifle. If you look at the top of the scale, can you see the figure 20? You have to multiply that by 100 to come out in yards. That vernier scale on the back of the rifle can be moved up to 2,000 yards. And a British marksman and a British first-class shot, even a second-class shot, will confidently open fire at 1,000 or 1,200 yards and expect to hit something in a target that looks like that. So many casualties were taken by the Germans when they buried their dead, and by the way, they normally didn't bury their dead. During the Franco-Prussian War, the rule was, if you are dead, you are boxed, a flag is put over your coffin, and you're sent home to your mother, always your mother, with the thanks of the Kaiser, and the family disposed of your corpse. Here, the casualties were so huge, they were forced to bury them. If you go to Langemark, one of the names I showed you, there's a very small cemetery, and it's got 44,000 dead, parked in graves of up to 20 at a time, caused by the fire from rifles bearing that site. The Germans invented a word, thinking of their high school students, thinking of their university students, and here it is. Kindermörder, child murder. At Langemark, there's a room devoted to the names of just the high school students and the university students. Child murder. There's a simple moral in this. Don't go to war if you can't bear the cost. Don't do it. By Christmas 1914, it's come down to a static line looking more or less like that. Up in the north, there is Ypres. Those two bottom ellipses are held by the French, and half of the bottom ellipse is held by the French. Everything comes to a standstill. The first trenches appear. This is a very crude, very early trench, and it went from the sea to Switzerland, all the way. Later, battlefield archaeology invented zigzags, so a single shell couldn't send shrapnel looking like that, down the trench, and that's what kills you, shrapnel. And it went from the sea to Switzerland, and they settled in. Rapid attrition from the first Battle of Ypres, as the war of manoeuvre continued until the point where it went static, caused a lot of casualties. You saw the shrapnel. I told you, you saw a battalion is 1,000, 1,007. There were 84 battalions at the first Battle of Ypres. But look at these figures. 18 battalions had fewer than 100 men. 31 fewer than 200, 26 fewer than 300. Only 9 had more than 300 men. There should have been 1,000. Do you remember I told you 80,000 was the British Expeditionary Force? Reinforcements were constantly being fed in at the back as casualties came out from the front. And up to the end of November, the British Expeditionary Force never had more than 80,000 effectives in the field, and it had taken 86,000 casualties. As quickly as the reinforcements were arriving, there were casualties to equal them. It was 100% turnover. Here's a battalion on parade on the 9th of November 1914. You did hear me correctly. I said here is a battalion, not part of a battalion. That is a battalion. You've seen them before. It's the people we saw on the square on day 1. It's the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Royal Regiment. On parade before you there are 2 officers and 45 other ranks, 47. Well, hang on, you said 1,007. Absolutely right. 960 are no longer with us. But it's a British Empire. And we delve deep into the empire. South Africans are coming, Canadians are coming, New Zealanders and Australians. The first available is the Indian Empire. The King of the United Kingdom is also the Emperor of India. On the 17th of October 1914, the Lahore Division, about 10,000 men, complete with their horses and their artillery, land at Marseille. This is an Indian cavalry regiment with horses to follow, marching away from the dock. What a fearsome... They went into battle looking like that on day 1, still in their Indian subcontinent service clothing. Terrified the Germans. They got used to it. Also coming into the line are the Territorial Force battalions, the National Guard if you're an American. 23 battalions come into the line before Christmas, and the regular army is beginning to feel some relief from the pressure. The regular army is bleeding to death. The depots around the United Kingdom are in every county. Every county has got a regiment. Some counties have got many more than one regiment. Lancashire's got lots of regiments, but they've all got a depot. That is a Victorian design. They are around to this day. That's in Wiltshire. That's where I'm speaking to you from, Wiltshire. And all the reservists are recalled to the colours in the United Kingdom. There aren't many. The Army Reserve, 145,000, the Special Reserve, 64,000, so about 200,000 reservists. And there they are, marching, having been recalled to the colours. The very bored, young, working class sees an opportunity to get rid of the fetters of boring work, adventure, pay, promotion, and they volunteer in their hundreds of thousands. Here is the new army proclamation. Join up, lads, join up. I want you to look at these words. I'll make it easy for you. Should the war last for more than 3 years, the continuance of service will be optional. I do wonder how many lived 3 years to exercise that option. A handful. However they went in through the doors of the depot, they all came out looking like that. Tommy Atkins heading for the front. Regular soldiers were to be brought home, to be relieved by territorial force divisions. So 48 battalions alone in India, regular infantry battalions, 9 regular regiments of cavalry. Look at the numbers for Africa. Bottom right, 12 elsewhere in the world, which I might draw your attention to: Central America, Southern America, British Guyana, British Honduras, the West Indies. All the regulars are to come home, to be replaced by territorial force divisions. I live in Wiltshire, and with South Gloucestershire, just to our north, there are 28 villages that have got war memorials with no names from the First World War on there. Everybody that went came home. They were spared the horrors of the Western Front. They're called the thankful villagers. A new type of soldier arises, the pals, the friends. Kitchener, Lord Kitchener, Secretary for War, is the only man with the clarity of vision to see that it is going to be a war of attrition. And he says it'll come down to the last million. And he has this conversation in London with two people, a general called Rawlinson and Lord Derby, a shipping magnate. Rawlinson says, well, there are plenty of people out there that are prepared to go to war. Give me a weekend and I'll raise you at least a battalion. And he does. In a weekend, he raises 1,600 men. Lord Derby, not to be outdone, goes to Liverpool and raises 1,500. Well, what do you do with volunteers like that? You raise the PALS battalions. Rawlinson's garnering in is in London, principally the Stock Exchange, where his contacts are, and they become the 10th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers. My regiment, the Royal Fusiliers. The clerks from the floor of the Stock Exchange. In Liverpool, it's the shipping clerks from the White Star Line, and so on. 17th Battalion, the King's Regiment, the 1st Liverpool PALS. Birds of a feather now gather together. PALS battalions are raised from footballers, from academics, from lawyers, from artists, cyclists, and the public schools and universities. This man is called Rickman. He retires from the army in 1909 as a captain in the Northumberland Fusiliers, goes into retirement very happy, recalled to the colours. Made a lieutenant colonel, sailed past major. He's given 1,000 men, an empty field, a few tents, a retired sergeant major, a fresh young captain to be the adjutant, and told, get on with it. The PALS are born. He is sent off to command the 11th Battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment, better known as the Accrington PALS. Where do you get your leadership? Well, if you're birds of a feather, you've got a natural leadership inside your parrot cage. Any factory that joins up together, any firm that joins up together, any cycling club that joins up together, have got natural leaders. And they, without any military training, become the corporals, the sergeants, and the warrant officers. Officers are appointed by reputation. By the end of 1914, there are 97 PALS battalions in open fields. By the end of 1916, 220. No need for a PALS after 1916 because conscription is introduced. You can have as many as you like. Go and get them. And here they are, the raw material. Look at that fellow top left there. Look at his ears. He's like a wingnut. Is he 18? I wonder. Doesn't look 18 to me. Bottom left, there is Rickman's battalion, the 11th Battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment, the Accrington PALS. They are to be lost on the 1st of July 1916. They go over the top 1,000 and they end the day a slack handful. Rickman himself is wounded. It's the end, the Accrington PALS. He raises them again, they are lost again. He raises them again, and they go into occupation in the Ruhr in Germany. He dies of sheer exhaustion at the age of 57. You can see in the bottom right what I told you, the open field, some tents, all through the autumn and early winter of 1914. No uniforms, no arms even. They do a lot of drill and a lot of PT, physical training. Shall we start on a couple of the myths and humbug? There's a romantic image. It'll be over by Christmas. The Army Postal Service was handling tons, hundreds of tons of Christmas puddings, Christmas cards, many of them addressed to men who were now long dead. Here's a romantic image. Certainly the British amongst you will have heard of the Christmas Day truce and the football match played in no man's land. There they are, playing football. Wonderful. This is an artist's impression. painted long after Christmas 1914. We know that, otherwise you would never have put that in the picture. That didn't arrive until the autumn of 1915, a design of defensive barbed wire. Hurdle, it's called a hurdle. And there they are, all sharing snaps and whiskey and chattering away. They play this football in the middle of no man's land. There's even a score line. Look at the score line. Saxons 3, British 2. Wow. It's innocence. A young German soldier, a young British soldier. Can you hear in the background, if you were around in 2014, can you remember Paul McCartney singing the Pipes of Peace? And as the German soldier walks away, he puts his hand in his pocket and he pulls out a bar of chocolate the British soldier slipped in his pocket. Very, very emotional stuff. But listen, it's a chocolate advert. I'm sorry, it's a chocolate advert. Didn't happen. But never mind the facts. The myth lives on. I've been to this place many, many times on my battlefield guiding tours. The cross is there. There's always a football there. On the day this is supposed to have all happened, the British had 43 battalions, 2 cavalry regiments, 9 artillery batteries, and an engineer company there. That brown is the football field, we're told. The Germans had 14 infantry regiments. That's a total of 69 units in that area, all of whom were keeping war diaries, the official record of the day, the weather, casualties sustained, operations undertaken, anything to report. It's called the war diary. So there are a total of 69 official references to that day, to that place. How many of them mention football? None. It didn't happen. But let not the facts interfere with a good story. The myth lives on. That's how it looked the last time I was there. Quite emotional, just not true. The place is called Ploegsteert. If you're ever doing a battlefield tour, do go to Ploegsteert near Ypres. The British soldier, of course, called it Plug Street. They did play football, but only when they were in billets. It was for morale and fitness. Those are the Wiltshires, down in Poppering behind the lines at Ypres, about 10 miles behind Ypres. He shall smite thee is a quote from the Book of Kings, Old Testament. During the period of Advent leading up to Christmas 1914, there's a proper Advent wreath, 3 purple candles, 1 pink candle, the Gaudete candle. What will smite you is a sniper. The Germans were good at it. And during the period of Advent 1914, 3,000 fell victim to the sniper in the Ypres salient. 3,000. It's the end of innocence, so you can forget that picture. I'm sorry, it's the way it is. Let's look at Christmas Eve, 98 fell to the sniper. Boxing Day, 62 fell to the sniper. And on Christmas Day, Merry Christmas, 81 fell to the sniper. They did meet. They did, I promise you, meet in no man's land, but in a very solemn mood. Why? Because that's what no man's land looked like on Christmas Day, 1914. It was a padres parade, a chaplain's parade. The main work of Christmas Day was gathering and burying the dead. There are the Germans doing it over there. Here is a German officer. You can just use white armband on his left arm there, liaising with British troops, sorting out, because the dead were mixed. And who's in charge that day? The padre, the chaplain, because they were gathering in, identifying where possible, and laying out for burial the dead, each man with a cross and a hand-painted name, rank, number, date on the cross. Humbug, incompetence and futility. There used to be, maybe there still is, an expression, lions led by donkeys. The lions being the men, the donkeys, the generals. I don't buy it. I just don't buy it. You go to war with the army you've got, not the army you need. And you have the generals that you've got. The war develops newer, younger generals, but you've got what you've got. 1,252 officers in the British Army served in the rank of general, one way or the other. 226 were killed, wounded or taken prisoner. That's quite a high percentage. Don't forget, a general isn't at the front with a sword on a horse. He's at the back so he can look forward and see his command. That's how generals work. And for that percentage to be casualties means they were as prone to risk as anyone else. I once was talking to my group, and a school was at the same place on the battlefield, and they were getting on their coach to go home, and I heard the history master who'd been taking them round say this: "So after 4 years you see it was all a useless slaughter." I cannot tell you the bad feeling that gave me. Those young people were being told it was a useless slaughter. I remind you of my grandfather's victory medal. And these are the words, the Great War for civilization. Had the war not been fought, had the war not been won, the first part of the 20th century would not have been civilized, certainly not in Europe. Well, there's General Melchett in the Blackadder series, top right. Now, he was a donkey, but he didn't exist in reality. There's the real commander-in-chief on the left. That's Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Now, he lived in that chateau that you see there. Not many generals lived in chateau. Not many. And certainly, if you were a general near the front, you lived like that. That's an Australian general, a man called Gordon Bennett. That's his headquarters up near the front. Doesn't look too comfortable to me. Not really. Here we have the town of Ypres. There is the glorious cloth hall. Behind it, the spire of the cathedral. A prosperous region, the cloth trade for centuries. Prosperous, prosperous Flanders. That's it. It is today rebuilt. But by the beginning of 1915, it looked quite different. This town is called Ypres by the people who live there who speak Dutch, Flemish. On the map, it's spelt in French, Ypres. If you're a British soldier and you don't do foreign languages in 1914 at school, what do you make out of YPRES? There's only one answer. It's wipers. Wipers. It was always wipers to a British soldier. Most of the war, he was at wipers, and it looked like that. That's the cloth hall. German artillery reduced it to rubble. Ypres was only finished rebuilding in 1965. The mud of Flanders is clay. And when you dig your trench and you live in your trench, you're covered in mud, clay, a yellowy brown. You can all see the trench sentry there. Well, he's obvious. How many other humans can you see in that picture? You lived there. 3 days normally in the front line, 3 days in support trenches, 3 days in reserve trenches, and if you're lucky, you get out anywhere between 9 and 12 days later and go to billets. There's one. There's another guy trying to get some sleep. Gets harder, doesn't it? There's another one. Can you see number 5? There he is. Dreadful. It was wet and it was freezing. Because the water table was very high, you were very often up to your thighs in water. It was total squalor. You dug a hole in the side of the trench, you lived as best you could. You froze, you were wet. You were very often hungry. Nobody cooked there. You lived on hardtack and open tins of corned beef. That's a trench. I swear to you, that's a trench. I'll prove it to you. Look, there it is. There's the trench line. But shells will collapse your trench. Do you see the machine gun, top left there? There's the machine gun post. That's the shape it should be. It's the Lewis gun. And you lived in that for at least 3 days before going a little bit further back. Bruce Bairnsfather wrote, he did cartoons for a magazine called Fragments from France. And there's a character there on the right called Old Bill. He's a regular. He's been in the British Army as a regular for some years, and he's been out in France or Belgium since the Battle of Mons. And up last draft came this wet behind the ears fellow on the left, and he's bitching and moaning and saying, is this what it's supposed to be like? It shouldn't be like this, should it? And the stoic old Bill says to him, if your nose of a better roll, go to it. It is what it is. By the way, the catchphrase of Captain Lars on the Sun as we wandered our way back to the United Kingdom just before lockdown. It is what it is. Germans weren't the only enemy. This is a serious enemy. When I lecture in the Star Theatre, I cast my eyes up when I do this, and I can see out in the audience unconsciously quite a few people doing that. Makes you feel itchy. Lice. Lice. The soldiers called them chats. C-H-A-T. Chat. When they got to billets, they would take a bar of soap. They would sit round in a group and they'd open up the seams of their tunic or trousers and they'd go down with the bar of soap, collecting the lice and scraping them off and throwing them away. Or they'd take a candle, light the candle, and go up the seam. And you could hear the lice going pop, pop, pop. And they would gossip and talk while they were doing this. It's the origin of the phrase, we were sitting around chatting. It's a chat. Lice, chat. Chatting comes from the First War. The other great enemy is there. To give it its Latin name, ratus ratus. They were big and they were fat and they made good eating. But they were eating discarded rations and bodies. Dreadful. There's a wood. That's the wood. That's all that remains. There's another one. If you've got an upper body wound and you can still walk, you're ambulatory, a shoulder wound, an arm wound, a minor chest wound or something like that. And the stretcher bearer says, can you walk, mate? Yeah. Well, walk down a duckboard till you get a regimental aid post. And you did. You walked down that duckboard. But by God, if you slipped off it and you went into that, it was too thick to swim in and too thin to walk in. And if you couldn't haul yourself out because your upper body was wounded, you'd die in there. You'd simply die, and many did. The third Battle of Ypres, the Battle of Passchendaele, was fought for this reason. Look at the map, look at the schematic. Can you see at the top of the map, Ostend? It was a German submarine base. And the U-boat warfare threat in 1917 was quite serious. They were sinking merchant shipping. And the Third Battle of Ypres was going to take Ostend and push on through Roulet and up towards Bruges to get round Ostend. And you can see the yellow line at the bottom. That is Messines. The first bit of the campaign was to straighten the line. The red was to take the high ground at Passchendaele. You can see P-Dale there. And the third phase of the battle was to capture Roulet, a railhead, then move on to Ostend. There is the strategic concept. The battle is to take place between the 31st of July and ends on the 10th of November. We didn't know it would take the 10th of November, but it did. And it becomes known as Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele. It's to be fought by the armies of the British Empire, and here are the flags under which those soldiers fought, not just the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, Canada, and so on. The high ground is marked in green, occupied by the Germans. The Battle of Messines does straighten the line. 21 mines are laid, 19 go bang. It's a victory for the British. What's the difference between 21 and 19? Well, mine number 20 went bang in 1956. We know where number 21 is, but it hasn't gone bang yet. Frightening stuff. The blue line depicts the British front line, and off they go on the 31st of July, uphill, and it starts to rain, and it doesn't stop raining. And the rain, of course, goes from the high ground to the low ground. A miserable, miserable campaign, crossing stream after stream after stream. There is Passchendaele, the objective. Zonnebeek to the south, Polygon Wood, Langemark to the top left, where you saw the hordes of German soldiers. It's a long slog, but on the 10th of November 1917, the high ground is taken, and they're just on the outskirts of Passchendaele. There is Passchendaele, taken from an aircraft in the spring of 1917. A village, a centre for communications, roads meet there and people come and go. 8 months later, at the end of the battle, the same piece of ground looks like that. I swear to you it's the same piece of ground. Look, I've marked the roads in for you. That is the same place after 1 million shells have fallen on it. The butcher's bill for the Third Battle of Ypres in total ends up like that. Grand total is that. More than 500,000 casualties from the 31st of July to the 10th of November. Staggering. The United States engages in 1916, but there's a problem. The United States has only got a very small army. It only has 2 jobs. In the past, the United States has wars with Mexico, and it's had Indian wars, even into the 20th century. And so the regular army has only got 2 jobs: keep the Mexicans out and the Indians on the reservation. So troops have to be raised in exactly the same way as the Civil War. Go to the States, get the governors to raise troops. Command of the American Expeditionary Force is given to John Pershing, Major General John Pershing, Black Jack, who's made his name in the Mexican War. I show you 6 stars for this reason. Pershing starts to go to conferences long before his troops have arrived, and he's sitting down with French generals and British generals whose cars have got stars on the front. And a British full general has 4 stars. And on the sleeves of the French generals, he's looking around the table. A French brigadier general has 2 stars. And a marshal of France, who's at the head of the table, has 7 stars on his sleeve. He cables Washington, says, I feel a little bit outranked here. Washington says, do what you think is right. And Pershing goes to the next conference wearing 6 stars. You're looking at your first and only 6-star general. Well, Washington soon puts that right, and he wears 4 stars. Even George Washington only became a 3-star general after he was dead, posthumously promoted. The doughboy begins to arrive in France, and by and large, he's only had 5 weeks of training in the United States, and he's being trained by officers who are holding governor's commissions and National Guard non-commissioned officers. He arrives in France. Pershing is under political direction to fight as an American force, not to parcel his troops out. He does loan his troops to the French. He does allow the French to train his troops. He won't allow his troops to be trained by the British. And Pershing is to become quite close to the French, but certainly not close to the British. The United States Marine Corps has been in France and operating effectively through the latter part of 1917. Why? Because the United States Marine Corps is expeditionary. It's tied to the United States Navy. It is good at deploying, and it knows about proper soldiering ashore. Not the same with the United States Army. A United States Army commanding officer of a regiment rarely sees more than 50 guys together in one place at one time. They're normally in penny packets around the reservations or along the Mexican border. So it takes the Americans some time to get into the war. More of that later. In March 1918, there's trouble at home in Germany. The politics have changed. The Russian Revolution in October 1917 have given progressives in Germany, who are becoming very disgruntled with the war, ambitions. There's rioting on the streets of Munich. There are food riots. There are shortages of everything. And it is concluded that there's one operation left, the last chance, if not for victory, then to get a decent armistice and end the war out of the Allies. Operation Michael is launched in March 1918. The Germans pour off that high ground at Ypres, as they do down through France, and they drive steadily towards the city of Ypres, and they are only stopped at the very gates of Ypres. They can't get in. Gradually, the steam runs out, the logistics run out, and the tide is turned. And we enter a new phase of the war. The armies of 1718, as far as the British and the French are concerned, are different armies. They're better trained, better equipped, and they've got better tactics. And what happens is, on the 8th of August, there's a major defeat for the German army up and down the line. The Chief of Staff, Ludendorff, summons the courage to say to the Kaiser, Majesty, not only must I say to you that we are not likely to win the war, I must tell you that we are certainly going to lose it. Everything changes. The German army starts a retreat which is not going to stop now for 100 days. And it's called the 100 Days. And they are chased and they are harried back out of France, out of Belgium. Americans and French coming from the south, masses of French troops. The British and the British Empire forces coming from the north. And where does it stop for the British and the Canadians? Here. At Mons, where it began. Here's a curiosity. The first soldier of the United Kingdom is killed at Mons on the 21st of August, 1914. He lies in a cemetery laid by the Germans. Private Parr. He's on a patrol before the Battle of Mons even really starts, and he's killed by German Uhlans, cavalrymen. The last soldier of the British Empire to fall puts his head too far up above the parapet at 2 minutes to 11 on the 11th of November. Everybody knows the armistice is coming in at 11 o'clock. And he says, I think I'll take a look. I met quite a few of his comrades in 1986 when I was stationed in Mons at the Supreme Headquarters. And they said, as soldiers do, it was his own fault, sir. We told him, keep your head down, George, and he didn't. And he was killed at 2 minutes to 11. The curiosity is that without design, quite by chance, those two gravestones face each other in that cemetery, the first and the last. I come towards the end and I must talk about remembrance. This is the town of Ypres, and those troops, Belgian troops, are marching towards the Menin Gate. The Menin Gate leads to this road, the road that leads to Menin, up towards Roulet, up towards Passchendaele, to the front, to the high ground, the Menin Road. That gate is symbolic. And a British architect designed a new Menin Gate to replace the old shattered one. Here's the King of the Belgians, King Albert, dedicating that gate. It is the custom there, from the very beginning, for last post to be sounded at 8 o'clock in the evening, in the beginning by gendarmes, now by the fire brigade. And it is sounded, come hell or high water, at 8 o'clock every night. I've been there many times with my tour groups. On the 20th of May 1940, that came to an end when a rather large number of Germans arrived during the Second War. The bugles were hidden. No last post. Then along came this gentleman. This is Brigadier General Mazczek of the Polish Army, commanding an armoured brigade. And in September 1944, he arrived at Ypres and began its liberation. The Germans went away, but they fought to the very end. And they were still firing when the gendarmes unearthed their bugles, went to the Menin Gate, which is still bullet marked from that very day. And as the firing was still going on, they sounded last post on the 6th of September 1944. Curiously, General Mazczek's name means in Polish, poppy, our symbol of remembrance. Poppies come in many forms. You see me wearing mine. The poppy is a Canadian invention. Do read the poem In Flanders Field by a Canadian officer called John McCrae. The poppy adorns the remembrance crosses. Of course, not everyone is a Christian, so it also adorns the Star of David. It doesn't adorn the crescent because that would be against the Muslim understanding of their symbol. It shouldn't be defaced in any way. And there are lots of Muslim fallen around the Ypres salient from our Indian army. I'm not sure anybody will know what that one is called. It's if you look at the top, it's like a turban. It's a khanda. It's a Sikh symbol of remembrance. And for those religions that have no symbol, or indeed for the soldiers who have expressed no faith, there is just the poppy. So the poppy comes in many forms. Here's one that you may never have seen, a brass poppy. And the brass comes from melted down fuse cones from airburst shells, which failed to explode and are found on the Western Front. British shells. That one, each one of those was made in 2016 to mark 100 years of the Battle of the Somme. And that one is to commemorate a gunner, a Jap. So poppies come in many, many forms. That was given to me by a very dear friend just today. Our duty of remembrance. 1 million died from the Empire, 2 million Germans, 2.5 million French. And even though in combat for a relatively short period, 100,000 Americans. The Menin Gate is specifically dedicated to one group of soldiers, as is the back wall of Coutts Cemetery, which is the objective. So the start line is the Menin Gate, Coutts is the objective. Because on the back wall of Coutts Cemetery and on the Menin Gate are the names of 90,000 soldiers who died and who have no known grave. They are the missing. No known grave. If there is a body and the identity is not known, all the gravestone says is known unto God. And so the poppy is a very dear symbol to us. I have been to the Menin Gate many times, and there, before the wreaths are laid, there is a covenant that reminds us all of our duty of remembrance. It's called the invocation. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at the end of the story. Not quite at the end of the story, but at the end of my story for this evening. It's been about a corner of the war, and in the words of the poet, if I should die, think only this of me, there is a corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And there are 202 cemeteries, Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries on the Western Front. I will take your questions and try to give some answers. Now they've been rolling in. Down to my left is my laptop, and I can see some very interesting questions. I'll look at, here's John in the United States. My dad served with the American Expeditionary Force during the Third Battle of Ypres, and I would like to learn more about this terrible period and campaign from the American perspective. I note, John, that you say he served with the AEF during the Third Battle of Ypres, but not at the Third Battle of Ypres. There were no American forces at the Third Battle of Ypres. What was going on during the Third Battle of Ypres elsewhere that involved the American Expeditionary Force was down in France. And there was fighting going on at Belleau Wood. The Marine Corps did terribly well there, the United States Marine Corps. Later in 1918, we move on to the Argonne, where we get the American Expeditionary Force heavily engaged. So the answer to that is, in 1917, whilst the Third Battle of Ypres was going on, the Americans were doing two things. One is the Marine Corps was actually fighting, and the army was going through very intensive training and reconnaissance. Let's have a little look further down. Oh, nice to see somebody I sailed with. There we are. That's Ron. Could the Battle of Ypres in 1916 been fought without the British incurring such terrible casualties? The truth of the matter is that you go to war with the army you've got, with the leaders you've got, the tactical thinking that you've got, and the weaponry that you've got. As the war moves on, you develop. Well, by the time we get down to the major battles around Ypres, certainly the Third Battle, there is no room for manoeuvre. The trench line goes literally from the North Sea to Switzerland. We don't have either the geography, oceanography, or the capability to do an amphibious landing, because in the First World War, the Netherlands is neutral. So trying to go round using an amphibious force, you can't get in through Belgium because of those low-lying areas, the Walcheren Islands. You can't get a naval force in there. You can't go to the Netherlands, they're neutral, and you can't land in Germany, it's too well defended. There isn't the air capability, there's no parachute capability. I'm afraid we are stuck with what we're stuck with, which is almost inevitably everything you do is frontal assault. The technological advances do come along, of course. Air power comes along. The air plan for the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 is so complex. The first tank battle at Cambrai in 1917, a complete breakthrough, but the technology is in its early stages. The tanks aren't the Panzers of 1940. They are man-paced 3-4 miles an hour machines. So I'm afraid what comes out of this is the inevitability. Casualties are going to be very large, and they are. The Battle of the Somme, it costs $1 million on both sides, and on day one of the Somme, 20,000 British soldiers on day one die. Another 40,000 are wounded. Let's move on down. Here we go. We've got, oh, hello, Vincent Ruth Ogilvie. We met them out in Australia on, which ship was that? I can't remember. That was, oh, I can't remember. Could you comment on the role of the Canadians in World War I and their role at Vimy Ridge? Right, well, leaving, the Canadians, by the way, were very significantly involved in the Third Battle of Ypres. Vimy Ridge is the Canadian battle. It's the first, it's down in France, and it is the first time that all the Canadian divisions, 4 divisions, come together and they fight under their first corps commander, who is a Canadian, a man called Sir Arthur Currie. He is, by the way, the general that liberates Mons on the last day of the war. Where he got him from, I don't know, but either side of his saluting base, in the middle of the afternoon of the 11th of November, he's got 2 red-coated Mounties. Where'd they come from? A miracle man. And Vimy is a huge Canadian victory. Sir Julian Byng, a British officer, a British general, has commanded the Canadians up to that point. And so well did they think of him that the Canadians invited him to become the Governor General of Canada. Canadians gave an awful lot during the First World War. Little known, certainly to many Canadians, is that not all Canadian troops that we now think of as Canada were Canadians. The Newfoundland Regiment, for example, down on the Somme, was not part of the Canadian Army. It was part of the British Army. Newfoundland was not part of Canada. It was a dominion. So, other interesting questions. Did the shooting of the Archduke and his wife actually really start the war? The answer is no. It was a catalyst. It didn't help. It gave the Austrians an excuse, but the war was always coming. The political ambitions were never going to restore diplomatically or politically. There was going to be a punch at some stage. I often think of world politics as a big boiler. And if the safety valves begin to go rusty or to gum up in some way, if you keep stoking the boiler, and in the modern context of diplomacy, you can think of events around the world, Nagorno-Karabakh, you can think of the Balkan states, you can think of the Baltic states, things that go on, stoking the boiler, unless you keep the safety valves going, and that means international diplomacy, the United Nations, people not getting hot-headed, then the boiler will at some stage blow. And so I'm afraid the diplomacy ran out and the First World War started. How long did it take the United Kingdom and its territories to get their prisoners of war back? Fairly quickly. They weren't cruelly treated like prisoners of war of the Japanese in the Second War, but Germany began to starve, and you don't feed your prisoners first. There were prisoners of war camps in Berlin, I mean, miles away from the front, where the soldiers had malnutrition. Mustn't forget that conditions on the continent were very poor. Think of the Dutch. The Dutch were neutral, but they couldn't get trade in and out. They began to starve. So yes, the POWs did come back quite quickly. We didn't repatriate the German prisoners so quickly. If you look at the Second World War, the last German prisoners of war didn't get back to Germany until 1948. We held on to them in the United Kingdom. Let's look a little bit further down. What percentage of casualties were caused by disease, artillery, bullets, and gas? Okay, I can't give you exact figures here because one rolls into the other. Let me show you a couple of artifacts, if I may. These two things here, these two little things, are 18-pounder balls. The British 18-pounder was the standard field gun. It fired a shell up into the air, it came down, it was on a proximity fuse or a timer fuse, and it went bang. And it fired like a giant shotgun at the ground. And even in the trench, these things were arriving from above. And certainly if you were open, hundreds of these balls flying would spoil your entire day. I earlier showed you the shrapnel. That's from a much bigger shell. But that, if you are advancing as infantry, that is going to kill you or take off your arm or your leg or whatever. What you hope as a soldier, and this sounds brutal, but what you hope as a soldier is to wound another soldier, not kill him. Because if you kill him, he ceases to be a problem. Not just for you, but he ceases to be a problem for his comrades. Wound a soldier, and it takes another couple of soldiers of the other side to get him to safety, pick him up on a stretcher, take him away. So you take at least 3 people out of the battle, not 1. Disease, trench foot. took a lot of people out of trenches. More people left the trenches for trench foot, which is wet and cold, than for bullets and bombs. Lung disease. Gas was invented by a man called Franz Haber, a Nobel Prize winner, a chemist. And he invented gas, and it was first used in the Ypres salient against French troops, Senegalese. They broke cover and ran. Canadians were sent to cover the gap. They didn't know about gas, and they took very significant casualties. Franz Haber's wife was also a Nobel laureate, and she said to him, Nobel laureates should not be taking life. We should be here to promote life. And she and he fell out over this for the whole war. They didn't share a marital bed for the rest of the war. She was so angry with him. Let's have a look at a few more questions. How much? There's an interesting one. How much care was taken to ensure that the identity of the unknown warrior, of the unknown soldier, was and remains unknown? Today, by the way, is exactly the 100th, it's the centenary, it's the 100th anniversary of the laying to rest of the unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey. He was one of 6 who were disinterred, and they were laid out in a room, in a barn, and an absolutely of no consequence officer was told, go and pick one of those. They had no rank on them. They had no badges to identify them. They were in a pretty poor state. But they were 6 British dead. He walked in, he took a look along the line of 6, walked up to one and simply touched it. And he left. The other 5 were boxed and taken away and interred. He was boxed. He was covered with a Union flag, which, by the way, was on parade today and laid on the altar of Westminster Abbey. And he made his way to Boulogne, where French warships were drawn up. He was put aboard a British ship, brought back to England, taken to London, and he left in his coffin to go to Westminster Abbey and past the cenotaph, where the king put a wreath on the coffin. And he went to Westminster Abbey and was buried among the kings. Looking on were 1,000 widows or mothers who'd lost their sons. And the theory is that he could be the husband of or the son of anyone there present, or anyone in the British Empire who lost a son, a father. And so it's very emotional. But every care was taken. No senior officers were involved. There was no vetting, nothing. An officer, you go and do this. That one. And that was it. So we don't know. And we'll never know. And of course, what we should probably hold in our hearts is that he is every widow's husband. He is every mother's son. Let's have a little look. What I need to do, because I forgot to do it, is stop sharing my screen, and I'll do that right now. Stop sharing. Here we go. So, do I believe the Second World War was a continuation of the First? Absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles was so harsh on the Germans. If something happens to you and you don't like it, you tend to look for someone to blame. Adolf Hitler served with great bravery as a company runner in the First World War, and I've seen where he served. And he was a brave man, and he did get an Iron Cross, and he had to pick on someone to blame. He didn't just blame the Jews, he blamed the French. Germany was denuded of rolling stock. It had to pay huge reparations. Coal was taken, iron was taken, and it left a grievance. And it was that grievance that the Germans took on into the Second War. Some historians, many historians, certainly in the United States of America, the view was the Second World War was just a continuation of the earlier, what we call the Great War, an earlier European Civil War. So yes is the answer to that question. How did the Great Flu epidemic impact on the casualties of the First War? It wasn't just the casualties. I live in a part of Wiltshire on the southern part of Salisbury Plain, where a lot of training took place. And a lot of Australian soldiers, New Zealand soldiers and the like, were brought here to temporary encampments to await transports home. The flu pandemic broke out, and down the Wylie Valley you can see the monuments, and the cemeteries are full of them. Guys who survived the war to be killed by Spanish flu, and that of course resonates today with our COVID situation. The Spanish flu was a huge killer, and we've got the legacy here today. It's coming up, heading towards 8:30. I've kept you far too long. Let me just take one more question. I keep going. Let's see. I'm looking for a really good one. He says, if a football game did not occur on Christmas Eve, was there the singing of Christmas songs? Yes, there was. There are a great many records of Christmas morning of British soldiers becoming aware in the darkness that lights were appearing on the opposing German trench parapets. And these lights kept popping up. And eventually they could hear noises, and it was a song being sung. Anybody care to guess the song? Silent Night. Silent Night. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Still the night, holy the night. And the Germans sang that. The British had no response in a holy or Christian way. And as is always the case with British soldiers, you can rely upon them. You can absolutely rely upon them to let you down. And they sang marching songs. But the Germans did get very tuneful with Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. So, did the combatants allow retrieval of the dead and wounded after a day of fighting? No. It was that one occasion. It was unofficial, wasn't sanctioned. High command on both sides disapproved of it. And thereafter, local arrangements could be made. It happened in Palestine, and it happened occasionally on the Western Front. Somebody would wave a white flag and chance their arm, and there'd be a bit of waving, and casualties, close-in casualties, would be brought in. But as the war progressed, certainly into 1915 and beyond, there were huge belts of barbed wire, huge belts. And to try and get beyond those would take engineer effort, and it didn't happen. And if there was a big movement on the front, then you did go and try and retrieve your dead and repair your barbed wire and the like. But after the Battle of Loos in 1915, the dead were hanging on the wire for 9 months, just hanging and just rotting away and becoming skeletal. And it was very, very sad, terrible stuff. So no, little local truces, yes, but there was no rule about the battle's over, let's go and collect the dead. Now then, okay, let's do one more. Had flooding been used with success before Albert I opened the canal floodgates? The inundation, the Belgians call it the inundation. The Belgian army, when war started, was 120,000 strong. It was an antique army. They wore big leather top hats. The rifles with a bayonet on them were bigger than the guys. The only machine gun in a Belgian battalion was towed by dogs, and it relied on fortresses. But the Germans had invented a new shell called a lyddite shell, and it was fired from a Krupp gun, and it destroyed the fortresses around Liège with great efficiency. The Belgian commander-in-chief, a man called Le Mans, realized that an army surrounding forts was the wrong way round. Forts were supposed to be the guardians of armies, and he dispatched the army to Antwerp, and it moved very rapidly to Antwerp, meeting and defeating a German army corps on the way, by the way, which nobody talks about. But when they got back into the line in the top northwest corner of Belgium, they had lost about 10,000 of their army. Once they were behind the line and realized they couldn't defend, they opened the sluice gates and the place flooded. In the trenches, in very bad conditions, during the inundation, towards the end of the war, they lost another 10,000. And then when they broke out and joined the advance to drive the Germans out in the last 100 days of the war, they lost another 10,000. Dead. These are dead I'm talking about here. And so during the course of the war, and of course they couldn't recruit anybody into their army because Germany had occupied all of Belgium. And so out of their 120,000, they lost the 30,000. And they were under the personal command of their king, who is known in Belgian history as Le Roi Chevalier, the knightly king. He was absolutely worshipped as the king, King Albert. And so the inundation saved the Belgian army, but it ruined the countryside. It took years for the salination to disappear, but it did eventually disappear. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we will bring it to an end. Thank you for being with me in this corner of the war, in this corner of Flanders field. The battle ended, the third battle ended on the 10th of November 1917, almost exactly, with one day to be added on, to the end of the war, the armistice, 11 November 1919. And so there was to be another season of poppies. The poppies were to come again, and soldiers were to march through those poppies going to the front. So I leave you with the sight of soldiers marching again to the front through the fields of poppies. It happens to be my regiment, and the music is my regimental march, the British Grenadiers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Good night.